Hello and welcome to another podcast from Otaku Review. I am your host LB. Joining me as always is my co-host CT.
Evening, folks.
So this is our 50th podcast. It took us over 2 years to get here, but we're at number 50. So happy 50th episode to you.
Thank you. Happy 50th. I was going to say, if it was 50, then that must mean due to our rigid weekly constant content scheduling that we must be coming on just about 1 year. But maybe that didn't happen.
So, alright. The topic for this episode is going to be a lot more casual than usual. We don't have a list that we're going to be counting down or anything of that sort. Actually, the topic that we want to talk about today are our anime origin stories. This is something that CT and I have both kind of hinted around our various histories, but we've never really done like a deep dive into how we got into this crazy hobby of ours. So we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna jump right into things, and I'm gonna go ahead and let CT answer the question first, which is, how did you first get introduced to your very first anime title, and what was it?
Okay. Before I answer that question, I would just like to mention that going by, the Otaku review, this is actually the first episode where we're going to fulfill the literal reading of it because we are Otaku and now reviewing each other. So, I have a somewhat convoluted answer to that, which
Imagine my shock.
by which I mean that to me, for instance, I am Eld. I was born in 75. So when I was a kid, there were, anime dubs on broadcast television in the US at that time. Could have caught things like Speed Racer. You could catch things like G-Force, Battle for the Planets, stuff like that. I do not count those as part of it, even though they are anime, and even though anime dubbed these days, tries to be a whole lot less edited and a whole lot more authentically translated. Back then, not so much. So, they'd just throw episodes out. They would change things around. They would get horribly mutilated. So I don't really count that as anime exposure. After that, before I picked up anything in my high school days, I was introduced to Robotech, which pretty much hit all of the buttons, and one might consider it, another hack job. And of course, the way that the project worked out, there were changes that they were going to make to get it to fit, and they obviously blended 3 shows together to get there. But frankly, I don't think it strayed too far outside of the kind of things Macross was trying to convey. In some cases, they were actually more mature than the source. So it feels much closer. So I half count Robotech as part of it. Certainly, I think with the timing and everything else and the subject matter, it primed me for what was to come. So my first actual exposure that I count was in high school. After I joined, I made friends who were upperclassmen because I would meet them through band or something like that, and I had joined marching band right away. So of particular people, it's a fairly easy way to blend the class and the age groups, anything extracurricular, and in this case, curricular classes. Uh, and so, back at the time, there weren't a whole lot of people doing things like collecting comics, which I was. So the ability to find other people who were into some of the nerdier crafts like comic collecting brought you together one way or the other. And one guy who was just a year older than me led me over to his favorite comic shop, which I would eventually start renting a lot of anime from. But not at the time. It was just being introduced to this guy, and a lot of this is lost to the mazy the mists of time. I believe he had an older brother. He was a sophomore in high school. I believe he had an older brother in college, and they were doing, like the college club stuff. People would bring tapes in, they would record stuff, and what happened was he had a bunch of tapes with anime on it and would lend it to me. And what I would do is I started just giving him VHS tapes to record his stuff onto, and he would keep collecting through the college club going forward. So I would give him tapes, he would give it back to me with everything that he had on it. So it became kind of a two-person swap. So the first, I know that the very first tape that I had from him and the very first anime on it was Bubblegum Crisis episodes 1 and 2. So that is what I consider my official entry point to anime. The rest of the tape, I believe, had Dirty Pair, Project Eden, Megazone 2 3 Part 1, and I think Great Digital Target. That sounds right. Possibly Venus Wars. There are a lot of things that kind of merged themselves pretty quickly in those first few tapes. But
Mm-hmm.
the other thing to mention about it is, of course, these weren't being broadcast on television, so they were not dubs. They also weren't picked up by anyone and legally licensed out here. And fan subbers really weren't a thing that they had access to. So, so it was effectively people passing around raw anime, and that's how I consumed most everything for the first few years, and an awful lot of anime. I would eventually pick up some subtitled stuff and be scared by the Warriors of the Wind dub for Nausicaa. Uh, but that I'm not sure how many years it was uh, that case, but more than a few. Uh, and it was largely just me and the other guy sharing, and occasionally we didn't really watch much together. Occasionally, and when you have people who can't really drive and can't hang out all that often, it became you'd meet at school, you'd swap. I'd give him tapes at school, he'd give things back to me, and then we would watch and chat about it at some point later. But so for the first few years, it turned into me watching a lot of anime in raw Japanese over and over, looking up the occasional script that I could find on a BBS, uh, but that was few and far between, and doing it entirely by myself. But I was seriously drawn into it, and I had so little that these things I watched an awful lot. I just kept rewatching them. So there's and I would keep like I would make mixtapes by holding my mono mic'd stereo up to my mono speakered television and putting tapes together the music, because the music was all great. Uh, but that meant that they had both dialogue and sound effects in them. So because of how much I watched the anime, because of how much I listened to the music from those shows back then, when I listen to the actual music now, my brain inserts phantom dialogue and sound effects in the middle of songs, and I find that hilarious, just how deeply embedded that particular era is on me. Even now, lo many goddamn, oh my god, that's 30, that's way too many years later. I don't know exactly when I would have watched the first one. I like to think that I would have started my freshman year in late 89. I'd like to think that I watched the first one before it became 1990. I may be deluding myself on that. I may not have made the friend and had that before then, but I like to clutch to that last bit of I started in the 80s, though it barely counts. And in the end, it always matters more what you're consuming, what era the work was from, rather than when chronologically you started watching. But still, the Orange Road fan in me wants that 80s tie. So there we go.
So, all right, I guess it's my turn to share the very beginnings.
Sure, what stuck your foot in the door?
So, all right. So, my very first introduction to anime. Basically, my first introduction to anime, the very first time I watched anything from Japan and absolutely knew 100% for certain that I was watching something from Japan and
Me
it
too.
was anime. The very first time that happened was when I was 12 or 13, somewhere in that range. I think I was around 6th to 7th grade. Up until that point, I had heard about anime, but had never really seen it. Um, all I knew about it was this reputation that it was so much more dramatic and so much just more adult, I want to say, and then what I was watching on American television. So there was like this mythical glow around it. Uh, I just for some reason had it in my head that anime was better, and I needed to see it so that I could confirm this. So one day, while looking through the junk mail that came through our mailbox one day, I came across a video mail order service, a VHS mail order service that was offering an anime sampler that contained Project A-ko and Record of Lodoss War.
Nice.
Not all of Record of Lodoss War because it was a
Right.
VHS tape, but enough of it. So I remember I begged my parents to get this for me. I pleaded. I was just dead set on I need to see this. And they relented and they got it for me. And as soon as it arrived in the mail, I was ripping off the packaging. I was shoving it into VHS player. And I was, for the next like 2 or 3 hours, I was just enthralled with what I was seeing. Project A-ko was my very first pair of anime titties. And that alone I was just like, oh my goodness, they show this? This is amazing. And so Project A-ko made me laugh my ass off. Record of Lodoss War was like amazing high fantasy. I wasn't even that big of a fan of high fantasy, but Record of Lodoss War pulled me in. And I remember begging my parents more, that I was like, okay, I've had a taste of this. I want more. Please get me more. And at that point, they refused. They're like, yeah, no, we don't think so.
They saw the titties,
So
huh?
I guess so. I guess so. But yeah, which is ironic since they were letting me watch R-rated movies since I was very young, but suddenly an animated pair of titties was going too far apparently. But anyways, so I got through that sampler and I held on to it. I watched it as often as I could. But it wasn't until high school that I got to have my next taste of anime. And that would be through a friend of mine who was super into anime at the time. She was getting her hands on various things, and she introduced me to a couple of additional series. She introduced me to Digicarrot,
Hmm.
which she introduced to me as basically the Japanese equivalent to Looney Tunes, which yeah, not really, but
not,
we were in
not
high school.
quite, but
Yeah, we were in high school at the
the
time,
the
so it
language
worked.
wasn't well developed.
Yeah. So we watched that, and then she introduced me to Sailor Moon. And I got into Sailor Moon around the S series, which is the introduction of the Outer Scouts. And yeah, from then on, she introduced me to Toonami on the afternoon version of Toonami. And from there, it just snowballed. I was rushing home from school every day so that I could watch the trio of Sailor Moon, Rurouni Kenshin, and Yu Yu Hakusho. And it just snowballed from there until it became a full blown obsession a couple of years later. But we'll get into that a little bit later on, I think.
So, what basically once you met Sailor Neptune, there was no looking back.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Sailor Neptune, I think, was my first anime crush. I want to say, so it might have been someone else. Deeplit may have made a play for that, but again, I was 12 or 13 at the time, so
Right.
yeah, so not really quite thinking of the characters in that way yet. But yeah, Neptune I think was my first like genuine anime crush.
Just to wrap back around to the beginning, because I think that's sort of an interesting difference between us. I would I would say at that point, you know, I knew the general concept that Robotech was built off of Japanese series. I don't recall if I knew they were different shows put together. I think so because the visual style was a lot different between them,
Uh
even
huh.
like in that intro. And of course, I knew at that point that earlier shows, which I couldn't have, told you the difference between Speed Racer and the Flintstones when I was 4. But at that point, I would have known about that. But I don't think I really had, prior to actually witnessing something like Bubblegum Crisis, I don't think I had any semblance of like a reputation or knowing this was higher quality, this was more mature, this was unlike anything. I would obviously get there very quickly, but it hadn't even really occurred to me. Even though you got bits of that, of course, with Robotech, with Macross. Uh, so I'm sort of curious. Do you remember at this point how that might have filtered in? Were there things you were seeing in a blockbuster on the shelf, or people talking about them, or like that? I don't know what year this was, and who your friends were, or what kind of communication was going on at the time. I'm curious because you said that like you felt that there was this importance behind it prior to seeking it out actively. So I'm wondering if you recall how that congealed.
I honestly could not tell you. Just for as long as I could remember, I just knew about the concept of anime, and I knew that, and I had heard from somewhere along the way, that it was more mature cartoons. And that idea fascinated me because while I wouldn't say that I was like advanced in any way. I was kind of a mature child. I didn't really, you know, I didn't have the elements where I was, believing fictional characters were real. I never had that.
Hmm.
I always knew, for as long as I could remember, I could tell the difference between fiction and reality. Um,
We should teach that to some people these days.
so yeah, so I always knew, but so I don't know where in my life I picked up this idea that anime was just somehow better in whatever way. I just had heard about it, and I just always remember that it had this like mythical reputation, but I don't know where I got that from.
Some kind of Socratic ideal. You heard it floating around from kids playing basketball on the playground, and it just sat
Yeah,
in
I
your
think
hind
so.
brain, and that this is a thing. I need it.
Yeah, I think so. I think I just heard it from somewhere along the way, and it just implanted itself in my head.
Okay. Yeah, I was more curious because a lot of times I try to remember things, and the funny thing is, at this point, I would have been, online to the extent that you could be for years at this point. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think I started in like '86 going to bulletin boards and contributing in chat rooms and stuff like that, and learning to abuse emoticons from a very early age. Uh, so I'm
Some
a
things
little
never change.
surprised. Exactly. I'm a little surprised that anime didn't leak in there, but it was really, it was really on message boards, and there is a lot more like fantasy and other stuff, even when we were doing story threads or just
Mm-hmm.
general chatting. I was much more into role playing games, pencil and paper. So Star Frontiers was my first one when I was stupid young. D&D, obviously, a bunch of other things, but I even got into Middle Earth role playing and Rollmaster when I was still in middle school, playing with high schoolers and run by a 30-year-old adult at that point. Which, from the perspective of being what is it, a middle schooler is a little weird, but I had been basically chatting with these guys for years. It's one of those things that made the internet just feel at home for me because I didn't know how old people were. Everyone had, nicknames, usually from fantasy. So I would chat with Stormbringer. I would run around with the handle Silver Surfer because that was my first comic. So I wore that as my BBS moniker. So I was doing a whole lot of stuff, but I would use bulletin boards later after I had acclimated to anime to seek out anime related stuff. Somehow, even that, which I feel would have been a perfect avenue to bringing it in, hadn't leaked in. It was really just, the one guy happened to, and I met him to find a comic shop, and he was he would introduce me to Games Workshop tabletop stuff with a few other friends. We would play the Palladium Rollmaster RPGs with that group. So he just happened to be into anime, and I was, I think, the first, underclassman he could successfully corrupt with this. So, so it turned into that, but I hadn't been seeking it out, and it hadn't really permeated it until it was like, here's your tape, go to town, and to town I went.
So, all right. Okay, so we've talked about our very, very beginnings and how we first got introduced. Let's go just a little bit further. When did you know that you were probably either already or were going to be a hardcore anime fan?
I mean, it feels pretty much instantly for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I don't think you can watch and rewatch raw anime on 2 or 3 VHS tapes over and over, and like I said, record the music to play it. I would time code. I mean, this would take a little bit further down, but I'd have the song "Over the Top" from the Dirty Pair movie that I would play at the top of a ski slope with the ski club I was with, and I managed to figure out basically how to time it well enough that I would hit the very end and one of the little mogul jumps right at the bottom of the slope by the time the song was ending. Uh, yeah, I mean, basically it hit me like an isekai causing truck, right, pretty much right from tape one, and I was so deep into it that I have a feeling that's one of the reasons why it just never let go. I did have a period of time of not watching, but it was only for a couple years, and it was separately attached. We will probably get into that later, but there was the possibility that I would have not kept at it all that much, but that was literally 12 years down the line in the beginning, and for years I was pursuing it by myself. Then I had a bunch of friends to share it with, and it started huge and it continued, and it's evolved obviously here and there, but I had no illusions that it was not going to be a pretty huge formative thing for me at that point.
For me, like I mentioned before, I got my first taste in my my preteen, early teen years. That was my first taste. And then I got a little bit more of a taste in high school, but I didn't super get into it in high school. High school was when I was dipping more than my toe in. I was dipping probably my entire foot in, but I wasn't like hardcore into it yet. What changed for me and what ended up making all the difference was back in the day when Netflix arrived in the mail.
Mhm.
And I discovered while browsing around on my father's account that they had an anime section. And they had back then a vast anime selection. They had DVDs of the most obscure stuff that I had no idea existed. And from that's when it took hold of me. I had all the selection I could ever want at my fingertips, and that was enough to just push me headfirst in. I dove in, I watched Princess Nine and Sakura Wars
Mhm.
almost right away. They weren't my the first couple of series that I watched on Netflix weren't great. I was watching things like Sakura Diaries and little things like that. But yeah, Princess Nine and Sakura Wars, when I picked those up off of Netflix, that was it. The club had hit me in the head. I was seeing little stars and birdies, and I never wanted to emerge from that. I just consumed and consumed and consumed, and that was, yeah, that was when I that was my point of no return.
Gotcha. Open open ended. So you didn't. I feel like we should, you know, sync the years in some fashion. I was going to say that you, I guess, didn't have a like blockbuster rental phase and renting through Netflix, but if it was already that late, then that's a number of years in where that becomes the route. Do you recall what year that would have been then?
Let me see. I was when I was 12 or 13, that would be around the mid 90s, so around 94, 95-ish. Maybe a little bit earlier than that, but I want to say early to mid 90s is when I got that first taste. I entered high school around 98, 99, and that was when I got a little bit more of a taste. And then Netflix, I believe I that took hold of me. I want to say around 2001 ish.
Okay, so
Yeah, so
that
that's pretty much the timeline there.
so that's interesting as well because that's another point of I'm not even sure if it's comparing availability or personality types or other things that seems like you liked a number of things but it didn't sink deep until basically your availability got huge because you had an era where you were just following broadcast stuff. You had I assume very minimal that you could get a hold of otherwise with tapes or maybe watching with friends in high school. I feel like when I started, I would have gone in as deep as possible, and my only restriction was I had to give my friend tapes, and occasionally he would give things back to me, and then I would have more to watch, and I would rewatch it. But literally, I feel like if you had just dumped a truck full of it in front of me, I would have gone straight in. I'm trying to remember if I'm going to catch up my calendar, and I don't know if we want to do things by merit of like, are we gonna tie our stories to the calendar year or like pin them to years from when you picked it up first, or I guess just to carry forward from my end. During high school, I basically just got tapes from my friend Tim, and I don't recall if I found anything out in the field. And this was the era where, first of all, my allowance may have been $10 a week, if that, and a single subtitled anime tape of 2 to 4 episodes would have been like $45. So I was not going to Suncoast Video and feeding my addiction here. So I just used it to buy tapes and get stuff from. I guess I was still buying a lot of other novels and things. Dragonlance. I was still a big fantasy buff. If there's one thing that I'll give anime almost specifically, it was widening out my general sci-fi appreciation because so much from that day was literally all just sci-fi stuff. Certainly not just mecha, but a whole bunch of interesting things. Um, after after high school was over, we still kept up because they were around town. And in fact, because I kept up with him, I ended up going to a con that he was staffing at. So, in fact, my first convention was in 1995. It was Anime East 95, the only Jersey con at the time, and one of the few New Jersey cons, anime specific cons, since. I think that was its second year, and then it disappeared after that. So that was funny. But it would introduce me to a bunch of new types of merch and other things. Uh, I would acquire, from other people around. They were dumping. They'd go to their con and meet someone and dump their anime out there. But if I were thinking about it, like when I started in college as well and picked up other friends, they were not of the anime sort. They were of other gaming, like role playing games, Rollmaster, and more specifically, Magic the Gathering, which I picked up to a gigantic degree at that point. So I was playing a lot of other games with people, and anime was still around, but it was kind of in the background until I met a few more people, some of them through Anime East 95, uh, and through a friend. God, I forget how it went out. There's a friend who lived a few towns over who knew uh, another friend who I was closer within town who we played Magic with, and through him I met a bunch of other people who are the ones I've actually kept up with over time. And that group turned into just a big pile of nerd gaming stuff. We'd do World of Darkness, we'd do Magic the Gathering, we'd play computer games, we would do a lot of fighting games, and we started doing a whole bunch of anime watching, going into Chinatown to get, at that point, fan subbed anime in Chinatown was, $5 a tape, less if you bought a whole pile of them. So we would, every month or so, we'd go in and we'd come back with a crap ton of things. I'd buy a lot of music CDs, J-pop and anime related. We'd get a bunch of tapes. We'd hang out at someone's house for a weekend. We would consume everything, and then go back and repeat that process as often as we could.
Hmm.
We'd sort of trade off whose turn it was to buy the next pack of tapes at that point. So I went from a bunch of years of only watching, pretty much only watching raw anime, to going to a con, to leaping through gaming to a group of friends who we did a crap ton of anime watching with almost entirely as a group. And that's where we picked up things like Kenshin from Gun. That age kind of started, and we'd, someone would collect all of Gundam Wing. I'd collect all of Kenshin. Someone else got all of Flame of Recca. we would just go through series and pick them up. And I still have like a refrigerator box sized box of VHS tapes with all of this stuff, which is not doing anything, but again, it's one of those things where it represents an era that I don't want to toss aside. There, an era of physicality, which is pretty useless at this point. But but entertaining. So my availability, like my ability to go deep, just kept increasing with my ability to get to more stuff. And most of that was just logistics of the era. I would watch some things on television, but not a lot. I think I watched broadcast Sailor Moon probably more than any of the other shows at the time. I would have beaten out things like Kenshin just because we were getting the fan subs, so we were getting them from Japan quicker, at the very least. But with Japanese commercials, which was great. It was literally people recording off broadcast, and the fan subbers would leave the commercials in, which is another interesting thing that you don't get from the era and from all of the legal releases. You obviously never get to see Japanese commercials. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of another fascinating thing about going in through the fan sub angle, because for them to go as fast as possible, and they were obviously not really making money on any of this, so they weren't going to edit everything out, and frankly they probably thought that was a bunch of extra appeal and would leave them in on purpose. They would just translate everything else. I don't think they translated the commercials except on occasion. But so in the middle of all of that as well was the phase of go to Blockbuster and look at the anime section and watch it go from one side of one shelf to expanding to a bunch of them. So they were sort of witnessing the popularity of anime for a hot minute in how much of it was available in Blockbuster and how much of it was behind their adult door, because they would collect a bunch of hentai as well,
Yeah, yeah.
which was pretty hilarious. And the comic shop that I would go to, we would rent anime from him all the time, and because he had a bunch of us doing it, he would pick up the stuff you wouldn't find at Blockbuster. Like, Blockbuster would obviously have your Akira's and your Fist of the North Stars and your Legend of the Overfiends and your Dragon Balls and all of the most popular stuff. And they did have other things they would experiment with, but I don't think your Tenchi Muyos ended up there right away. Urusei Yatsura also didn't. But as soon as Anime Go started doing a bunch of stuff, the comic guy would basically get a tape in to start renting to his clientele, a lot of whom got the anime bug bit kind of deep. So there was a lot of renting going on as well, which also meant you owned multiple VCRs, and of course, of course, you stole.
Yes, yes.
You'd get money the once, and then we'd have a permanent copy of it. That's what you did. Thankfully, anime has solved the piracy problem since then. uh, but because we had the other crowd then in the late 90s as well, we were still going in and out of the city, but we also started hitting other cons. We would hit a bunch of gaming conventions, and then we also sought out larger anime conventions. And so we went to Katsucon and Otakon when they were still in the what the hell, the Huntsville Marriott in Virginia, something like that. So like
Mm-hmm.
97, 98, 99 became big, continuing to seek out anime con stuff. Uh, so that kept up, and I kept with Otakon for a while and started staffing there as well. So that was leading me in and around, and it's interesting to see what I'm compressing into this window compared to your timeline where you started later, but I think a lot of it feels like it didn't spin up seriously until, as you stated, you could start getting freely whatever the hell you wanted on Netflix. So from when you got to that point, how did you in what ways did you start branching outwards? Because obviously I got to know you from your journalism and other stuff. So when you got deep into watching, where did that start to go in for any of the other activities, whether it be con going or otherwise?
So for me, branching out, uh, I like I mentioned, I had so the start of my writing career is actually directly tied into me diving into anime. Basically, at the time, I was just getting my feet wet with writing online. I was writing for a consumer opinion website called ePinions, which no longer exists.
I remember that.
Yeah, I wrote for them. I was looking around on that website and I was writing little reviews here and there of various things that I had. And I was, like I said, getting my feet wet, learning how to write reviews. And I noticed that they didn't have that many anime reviews on that website. And I thought that was a niche that I could fill. So I started writing anime reviews, and this was back in the day of, much like the VHS tapes of only having 3 or 4 episodes for $45. I was getting 2 or 3 anime episodes per DVD for about $30. That was that was the stuff. But once I discovered that Netflix had an anime section and I could just rent, anime DVDs and consume them to my heart's content, I started writing reviews about them much more frequently. And eventually, I kind of became the anime guy on that website. In terms of branching out to like conventions and stuff like that, I basically kind of kept to myself for the first 2 or 3 years that I was watching and reviewing anime. I wasn't really, social media wasn't really a thing. So, it was kind of, it was hard. I wasn't like sharing my reviews out there with the world. I was just publishing them and calling it a day. Many of them were very bad. Many of them were terrible. But that's okay because, like I said, I was still kind of learning. It was 2005 when I opened my first website and I took all those reviews that I had written for ePinions and I published them on my own website. And that's where I also decided that I wanted to kind of make this into a regular thing. I wanted to make a living at writing anime reviews, which at the time I had no idea that this was not a viable career path. But I stuck with it, and I was looking up, tips on how to increase readership, and I saw, oh, you should post every single day. Don't know where I saw this advice, but I took it to heart. So that's when I started getting into anime journalism as well, and on top of my reviews. Again, my early news articles were absolutely terrible. I knew absolutely nothing about journalism, but it became a regular thing for me to the point where I was obsessed with it. And yeah, it was, but for those first 3 or 4 years, I just stuck at home, watched anime on DVD. I didn't really talk to very many people about it besides on the very first anime message board I joined was the old animeondvd.com board.
Hmm.
That was my very first one, and I remember being on there for a little while before I opened my website in 2005. And I remember that clearly because I actually wrote a message to Chris Beveridge at the time, and I'm like, hey, I want to open my own website and advertise it in the signature of my message board, but I don't want to compete with you, so is this cool? And he's like, yeah, whatever, it's fine. So yeah, So that was kind of the start of me branching out. My very first convention that I went for an entire weekend was SoccerCon in, I want to say, 2007. I want to say. I'm not 100% about that. But that was the first convention I went to for an entire weekend. And I loved it. I enjoyed every bit of it. And yeah, that hooked me in even more. But yeah, in terms of like branching out in other ways, though, and this is actually a question I'm going to turn back on you here in just a moment.
Oh my god.
Um, I didn't really get into the fandom all that much. I didn't um like write fan fiction. I didn't cosplay. I didn't get into that all that much. I kind of dove more into the industry side as quickly as possible rather than the creative fan side. Cuz like I said, back in that time I was um doing journalism, really poor journalism. I was doing reviews, and that was kind of my way of branching out and getting involved. But the question that I want to turn back onto you, though, is how deep into the fandom were you getting? Because you were mentioning that you were doing tape trades and you were going to conventions and seeking out other series that you could watch. Did you get into like the creative fan side? Did you like write fan fiction? Did you do cosplay? Did you get into that side of it like early on or even ever?
Yes, it's going to come down to what you might consider, the fandom community, the creative side. Uh, so let's see. As far as anything communal would have gone, my actual first exposures would have been wasting a whole lot of time uh, at the computer centers at my college because you had the nascent internet. You had your nice permanently connected Solaris computers, and you'd go to. You had the first graphical web browser Mosaic came out, and I could hunt down pictures of Ayukawa and other things. And also, you could find people out there. You could find certain sites like I don't know if you have much familiarity with what are called MUDs, multi-user
Yeah,
dungeons,
yeah,
MUPs.
I got into muds on text-based computers at the library.
Right. So
Yeah.
the MUDs, the MUCs, the Muses, the I like the MUSH acronym most because that one was for multi-user shared hallucination, and I thought that was
Hmm.
the best one. But they I was spending a lot of time doing that. So there is a bit of communal and creative stuff there because I would go to, let's say, a place and I would just role play with people uh, inside the muds. It wasn't, of course, always about going there and beating up monsters. I preferred the social ones. Uh, it was a lot less different from what I was used to when BBSing, which was a lot of message boards or chatting with a person who happened to be online because I like live chatting with people at that point, just having a weird text based conversation. So you'd find an anime muck, and what it tended to have were people who were just programming their own, descriptive communities. They would create something for you to what is it to just enjoy and wander around in as if you were exploring like an infocom game. There wasn't anything much to do other than explore because either you couldn't do or I wasn't competent enough to put tasks and other things into it at that point. But it would be like, okay, let me connect Abakabu, the cafe from Orange Road, to this section of town. And then if someone happens to go into this supply closet, they'll find this handle and it'll open up and it'll take them down an elevator ride. And I was like attaching Megazone 2-3 to the basement of Abakaba. So there, there was weird stuff like that, but it wasn't much of a community. I knew these people even less than normal because they would come and go. And a lot of times they wouldn't even have the same names. I wouldn't be able to identify everyone necessarily. So it was still a lot of me singly doing stuff. It was just a wider amount of it. Like I could search out new works. I discovered Hitoshi Doi's anime Seiyu database, and I would discover who played roles I liked and what other anime there was, and I'd search that out. I'd go to the anime web Turnpike, and I'd find people's blogs and fan blogs and other stuff. It wasn't. It was a part of the nascent internet community, but it wasn't like a social thing. When I did when I did start going to cons, because I started my first con staffing, and I went to other cons, and I would gopher at them to a level that I would get things comped and paid for, because still being a rather poor bastard, it was the kind of, it was what I could do to be useful, and it was interesting to spend time like being the bag check people at Katsucon or whatever. A friend and I would do something. We'd make up our own system. We got very efficient at it. We were just playing my CDs the whole time nearby. But in the meanwhile, you would get your membership paid off, depending on who you are and how you were doing it. Sometimes rooms were comped, and all of that was very important because gas was expensive, and you wanted to waste every last bit of remaining cash in the dealer's room or one of the side rooms where people were selling bootleg stuff. So a lot of the even while I was going to cons, a lot of the uh, things you would normally think of as communal activities, cosplaying, I did not get into. I didn't get into, writing or ficking or paneling or anything, even in the amateur end of doing that kind of stuff. One of the unique communities I did become a part of was I got into a lot of at cons. I would go visit the art show and supporting artists out there. But more than that, I would go to the art auctions where people had put up artwork and folks would bid on them, and then you'd have a big bidding war at some point at the end if enough attention was on it. But I used to go to these and search out certain things and try to find the right stuff and hit them in the right way. I was doing eBay tricks at anime art auctions rather before there was much of an eBay to speak of. I would develop, I would chat with some of the artists. One of them I got to be decent friends with. He gave me a sketchbook, which I didn't use to sketch because I do not have any kind of hand-eye coordination that's in service of the creative visual arts. Uh, but I would use to try to get sketches from some of the Japanese guests. And there were a few of us who did that kind of thing, so we had sort of a mini collection of us who were always seeking out autographs and panels of the Japanese guests. Uh, I would occasionally grab parts of their artwork. I would develop a taste for particular works from certain artists, and then I would basically make requests for them to bring things to the next con, which I would then go for. Uh, some it's interesting to see what's happened to certain people because uh, I assume you know Yaya Han as
Yeah,
far as
yeah.
right a weeb personality at this point. Well, before she was doing anything in the cosplayer and anything else back in the day, she just had a certain style of art show stuff that I happened to like, and was one of those people who was doing very well in the on the art show floor and in the art auction. So it was interesting when like she stopped doing any of that stuff, and I was like, ah. But obviously she went in another direction, which proved to be much more lucrative, and one cannot hardly blame. But so there are certain connections with folks that you'd make at the cons. It's a different sort of quasi social thing, just not creative from my end. Uh, there are a few personalities that we'd get to know at art auctions where there'd be some rich bastards and the crowd would work against them because they'd just keep not overbidding, but they would keep beating other people to get to
Hmm.
certain works. And it's just other people who had the remainder of their thing, and he just came from his nice lucrative job and had a fat wad of cash to spend, so he'd keep effectively stealing from people, and then you'd have a nice little communist moment where other people would add, "I'll give you $10," and give someone to counterbid against it. See, you'd get into these weird little things. One of the other common things that I did a lot was get involved with the anime music video folks. And I did pick up a Pinnacle card. I did have ideas and I wanted to follow through and maybe go down that line. I think that would have been my best chance of getting into something from the creative end, would have been joining into what existed of, the late 90s anime music video community, because there was a lot of good stuff, a lot of classic stuff between 97 and '01, but I never did get around or have time, especially after you have to, get a normie job and do actual things. So it became something that I couldn't devote into, and eventually fell away from, as I fell away from cons and the hobby in general after uh, in like 2001 until Haruhi brought me back in. So that was
Hmm.
you were picking up right as I was in my void, my hiatus. I feel like the last anime that I watched was Magical Shopping District of Benabashi at Otakon '01, and then I was just sort of disenthused because I was still staffing for a period of time, but like the things we wanted to do got ground down in the general annoying politics of doing con stuff, and
Hmm.
so I just sort of dropped from that and and watched a few things at the last one, but decided not to continue on, and that was what caused me to lose enthusiasm with anime in general, because at that point it was associated with as much of the community that I had, which was staffing at a few cons, which was the things that I would do with art show or otherwise. So once I lost that sort of connection, it detached me from anime in general, because anime still wasn't a trivial thing to keep up with on your own at that point. You didn't really have video streaming. You weren't at the high bandwidth ability to do it at that point. It was still go out and buy expensive tapes. Uh, the the other friends had started to split and move into other parts of the country, so there were fewer and fewer people who were around or wanted to continue, and it became easy to just kind of let it go by and ignore it, uh, and then I would be brought back in later. But that's sort of the extent of the community that I would do. Nothing much on the
Mhm.
creative side. Unfortunately, I feel like there was lost opportunity to go into writing of some sort, because that's always been a background drive, just not something that I could keep up with jobs and overcoming general inertia in life.
I get it.
But I've always had the kind of community that's reflected in, the bulletin boards and other stuff, which is how I would get back into it later, and Discord communities that I fill with 500 channels of anime seasonal chat. So that has, for the most part, stuck around, and I don't see that.
So I'm curious, when you were young and you were, you know, going through your early otaku phase, did you have an otaku dream? And what I mean by that is, did you ever like dream of getting like professionally involved with anime at some point in the future, like, you know, becoming a voice actor or something along those lines? Did you ever have those years where you thought, oh, I totally want to work in anime and make it my life? Did you ever have those?
I don't think so. Not on that thing. I mean, it always kind of felt like, yeah, it would be nice to work for, someone in the industry that I admired, your anime goes or something like that. But I didn't have, skills to bring into the industry that way. I didn't think about, writing for, even though obviously I read magazines and other things. So I didn't have a dream and I wasn't pursuing anything. The closest I think I would get was because I was into, I'd been playing trumpet and like piano since I was a tiny person, and trumpet through all of my elementary and high school years, and marching band and jazz band and choir and other stuff. I always kind of wished that I had some avenue to continue music in some fashion. I didn't go to school for it, and I didn't really have that drive either, which is, I think if I was going to do anything creatively, artistically, uh, going into, uh, vocals would have been my best bet if I'd pursued that after high school. But because I was still so stuck on the music, but the only thing that became a background dream was to find effectively some people, and become, you know, a con-going troupe of essentially. I even named us the Otaku Jukebox, and basically
Hmm.
get invited to cons, travel to them, be guests, take up residence in whatever cafes they had, and be part of the. There'd be a lot of karaoke stuff going on, but do performances, hang out at certain times, take requests from people, play sets of anime music with a small group of friends and folk, and just become a wandering troupe of troubadours. So if I were having a weird, crazy dream of some sort, that was the extent of mine, which would be find a bunch of people to continue doing stuff musically and otaku adjacent with. And I mean, technically, if we made money on it, we would have been professionals. So there you go.
I also went through a very short phase of wanting to create an anime band. Um, I got as far as recruiting people, but never got much further than that. And it was just one of those dreams that kind of just faded away after a while. I also went through a short period where I was dead set on moving to Texas and becoming an anime voice actor. I came very close to doing that actually. It ended up not working out, thank the gods. Um, so little things like that. So yeah, I mean, I had my biggest otaku dream though, and this was the big one for me. Was I was convinced that all I had needed to do was get some money together, travel to Tokyo, and then I would be discovered and I would be turned into the next, flavor of the month idol.
There you go.
That
That's
was that
that's
that
a
was
more
my big
unique
one.
dream.
Yeah, that was my big one is that I wanted to go to Japan and I wanted to become and I wanted to be discovered and turned into an idol. So
So
that was the
which
big.
anime had you watched that solidified this dream here with you? Where it's was Love
I
Live around yet, or
No, Love Live was not around yet. I honestly do not remember what anime put this idea in my head. It could have been damn near anything, but yeah, for a while there, I was just like, yeah, you know what? I want to become a Japanese celebrity.
I mean, there was an Orange Road episode where Hikaru gets discovered on the street, but that was a modeling gig.
Hmm.
And I also know for sure you didn't watch that until
Yes.
just recently. Uh, yes, it's hilarious how much that feels like a meme, but that I'm thinking, wait a minute, would it have been at that time? How did it sink in? I suppose if you're going to dream big, though, that's pretty
Yeah,
big.
yeah. So that was my that like I said, I had little otaku dreams along the way, but yeah, the big one was I wanted to get discovered in Japan and become a big star there. But yeah, in terms of dreams that did come true was when I started my website, I was bound and determined to get my foot in the door. That was the whole reason for me launching the website to begin with was I wanted to get my foot in the door of the industry. And it took me a couple of years, but I finally got there. So, yay for that.
Now, did that create something that got you notice that they reached out for, or was it more like that simply became your portfolio? And as you spoke to people or reached out to people or in the industry looking for writing talent, you had probably a lot more of a thing to point at where someone could just go in and view your writing style. I'm wondering whether
Yeah,
or not, like, did the
uh,
site itself do something, or was it just at least showing enough determination that opened the door further at certain sites?
Yeah, it opened the door for me widely because it showed off my writing style at the time. It also showed off my dedication to how driven I was for this. My very first like professional writing job was for a website called Ani.me. Um, that was my first professional writing job, and I remember I really impressed my boss at the time with how dedicated I was with I was since I was posting pretty much every day while still balancing a job. Um, and yeah, that was an impressive feat, especially back then. Uh, but yeah, and that got me my first professional writing job, and I kept that website open for years afterwards until it eventually came down in like, oh, I want to say in the late 2000 teens. Um, so yeah, but I kept that website open, and it was my, badge of honor, my portfolio, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, that
Well,
website opened a lot of doors for me.
at a certain point, of course, you could just link to other sites that were still running and kept things up.
Hmm.
Any.me does still exist. I'm curious if I could still find your reviews on it, though.
I doubt it, for various reasons, none of which I want to go into on the air.
Alright.
Uh, but yeah, no.
Spill the
If
dirt.
you if you really wanted to go back and read my like early writings from that era, you'd have to use the Wayback Machine.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Now, I ran across you, of course, when you were with J- J- Japanator? J-
Japanator, yeah.
Japanator. uh, how far down the road was that for you as far as popping between sites and
Japanator was my second
oh
professional job. I had worked for Ani.me for about 3 to 4 years at that point. And things were starting to go sour. So that's when I started looking for additional work, and Japanator was kind enough to accept me, and I only worked for them for about 3 to 6 months, I think. It was a
gotcha.
very short time. But I made some, but yeah, I made some. That was the. I think Japanator was the job that got me a little more noticed, because it was a larger website than what I was working for before. Um, so yeah, I think Japanator got me a little more noticed. That was about, like I said, I want to say 2013, 2014. So I had been writing for about 10 years, but yeah, Japanator was my second really like professional job.
The amusing thing, and well, I mean, you might have to what is it to recall just when we would have done the episode because of course you started the only creative thing that I guess I can say I really contributed to now, which is podcasting. But I suspect that would have been your break into doing any podcasting of any sort at that point, right? With the couple shows that were with JTOR AM.
Yeah, JTOR AM was the first regular podcast that I participated in. Again, I think that helped get me noticed a little bit more, because we didn't we had a podcast on Ani.me. It wasn't very good because I wasn't interested in doing audio editing back then. So it was just we would record something for a couple of hours. I would not even go through to sync it or edit it or anything. I'd just post it and call it a day. JTOR AM was the first really like professional production, regular production that I was a part of, and that was a lot of fun,
Yeah.
and that's what prompted me to start launching my own podcasts a little more seriously and taking them and trying to do them a little more regularly. It wasn't until you and I started podcasting regularly a couple of years ago, though, that it really stuck. So,
But the reason that I mean, there's more than one reason to bring it up, but the reason I was bringing that up specifically was there was a time code. If you can remember how much longer it ran for after the episode that you had me on as a random guest, I can time code that for you because I remember what we were chatting about. In the broadcast times at that point, it would have been very very early in Your Lie in April, episode 6, as I recall, had just broadcast. So therefore, it was in November of 2014. So if you remember
Okay.
how long you'd been doing it up till then, or how much more it took before it fell apart, then you can drill in and determine exactly what was going on there.
Uh
I do recall that JTour AM show, the one where you guys basically chatted about the new episodes weekly, whichever ones you were interested in keeping up with. That
uh-huh.
was that was where I first heard about Space Brothers, and it certainly got me interested in it. There was little chance that I wasn't going to run across it at some point, but definitely it keyed me in, for which I am, of course, fairly grateful because it is the greatest show in humanity. So, I mean, what? But I think you were trying to squeeze out of the little gray cells just how much longer it might have run after that point.
Yeah, I honestly, those years kind of blend together a little bit. So I'm not entirely sure about the timestamps there.
What kind of a shakeup went on there? Because it felt like a bunch of you were let go at the same time. Was it just general site not doing too well, or were they acquired by someone?
If I recall correctly, and Japanatour doesn't really exist anymore, so I don't think it's a big deal for me to talk about this.
Right.
Um, at the time, it was, if I recall correctly, it was budget cuts.
Mm.
It was just a lot of a. My time at Japanatour was basically an internship. I didn't make hardly any, if any, money from Japanatour. I was supposed to. Eventually, I was going to be brought on as paid staff, but unfortunately, that just ended up not working out. And due to budget cuts, a bunch of us decided to leave at the same time, including myself.
Gotcha.
So yeah, but I still loved my time at Japanatour. It was a really fantastic learning experience for me, and I'm still good friends with people that I worked with there. So yeah, definitely it was a rough patch,
Mm.
but it was one of the funner jobs that I've had in my career.
That was a Destructoid own thing, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
Did you ever end up doing anything for the home brand in the future, or
No, I didn't. After I left there, I went back to my own website for a little while, and then I went on and I've worked a number of jobs since then for various websites. I've bounced around quite a bit over my career.
yeah.
But no, I never worked for any of the other Destructoid Network websites.
I'm trying to remember now when when and how were you doing con related press stuff, or was that really you would keep an eye on the press and make articles? You would do the journalism bit, but you weren't at con doing it, or was there? I'm trying to remember how your professional con interaction went.
I started going to cons out on a professional level around 2007, 2008. I had been working my own website for, a couple of years at that point. Had gathered up some reviews and was, leaving business cards and flyers around Sakura-Con. I didn't go to many cons beyond Sakura-Con for a while. It wasn't until I was working for Ani.me that I was given a travel budget and I was able to travel to many more cons around the West Coast. I think my record is I attended 5 cons in 1 year once,
Hmm.
which was fun back when I was in my 20s and I had energy. Uh, these days, if I tried to do 5 cons in 1 year, my body would kill me. But yeah, but that was, and then that was getting my experience working professionally at cons. I had a blast doing that. I still love covering conventions. It's a really big adrenaline rush for me. Um, but yeah, no, I
Especially
was.
these last 2 years, where the cons have. Oh wait.
But yeah, no, I started working cons professionally around 2007, 2008, I want to say. And yeah, I've been attending as regularly as I can ever since. I still write convention reports whenever possible, even to virtual conventions. I've written about Anime Lockdown a couple of times.
Hmm.
I wrote about KumoriCon in Portland, Oregon this past November. So yeah, I mean, I've been hitting cons professionally as much as I can. I didn't get into paneling early on. I was so busy covering industry panels that I didn't have time or the effort or energy to put together convention panels, but that's become something a little more frequent for me. I enjoy doing panels now. I've built up enough knowledge in my head that I feel
Hmm.
like I can share it with people and have it actually be interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're saying when you started going to cons from a press angle, that's kind of when I started going back to cons, which was only shortly after I started watching anime again,
Uh huh.
which times fairly well with the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya.
Yeah.
One of my friends who it took a while, but I hooked back up with him. It, in fact, is one of my oldest friends. We went to preschool at our temple together, so I've technically known him since we were 4. Uh, and we went up through high school together. Although at the time, he was not he did not pick up any of the anime related stuff. He would get into that later through another angle. And a duffel bag filled with Ranma One Half, which we picked up from Anime East. But so I was on a message board with him, and he would start feeding certain things back in. I hadn't really been keeping track, but the fact that he pirates anime religiously and has apparently since '05, uh, he he would just lay out links to here's how to watch this show, and I'm like, okay, well there's no problem with me clicking on this link here. And so my re-entry was with Bludgeoning Angel Dokuro-chan,
Hmm.
which was an amusing re-entry. But
Yes.
and that was fun, but it's ultimately fairly inconsequential. It's goofy, but the thing that basically made me remember fully, as it were, was the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which he was dropping as it was broadcasting, so it was in broadcast order, basically as fast as fan subbers could make a version available.
Mm-hmm.
And that really stuck with me because the first episode and what it represents, the fact that it was out of ordering and being all weird, uh, that dug its talons back in. And shortly after that, I had a friend who out of nowhere said, "Hey, you want to go to Otakon?" And that was odd because I hadn't really gone conning with this guy too much. Yeah, I know he'd been to at least one or two back in the day, but he wasn't really an anime conning crowd back from the late 90s through '01. But he was with an artist, and she was a con going, like, hit every possible con in the area sort. So for in 2007, I started going back to cons just because they already were, and I could just sit in the van with them while they were going to a convention, hang out, help pay for rooms, and do other stuff. So I hung out at the cons that they were going to, and I helped them at the table when it made sense and helped with loading and offloading and all the other stuff. So it was interesting to get sort of a re-entry to conventioning on the back end again, this time not as staff or as gophering, which is what I had been doing before, but this time from the artist and the dealer uh, and I don't know the most number that I went to in a year, but it was actually quite a lot because they were going to everything reasonably within like 6 hours the
Mm-hmm.
entire year round, and so it became fairly trivial. I would just, if I had been working, I would just take a Friday off or what the fuck ever, uh, and uh, and hop along, and so it became a weirdly communal sort of thing. And that friend also introduced me to didn't really it was a weird thing because what he wanted was he wanted to get at least one thing from each con that they went to as sort of a okay, this represents this con that we went to. He would fall out of the habit after a while, but he started, and what he started doing was just essentially collecting scale figures. So that became one of those things that took with me because I'd been to cons for years, and the figures back in the late 90s were utter crap. They were, I grabbed garage kits, but I had no talent for sanding and sculpting and painting either. So I never did anything with them. They would have the occasional doll, which were creepy. I think Umi from Rare succeeded at not being creepy, but everyone else was pretty bad. And anything else just wasn't very good for a long period of time because it was dealing with vinyl and stuff like that that was all in the garage kit area. But by 2007, you started having PVC that was good quality, pre painted, interesting poses and other stuff. And not only that, but you started having some of them that were being like reasonably priced. The
Mm-hmm.
the Bome collection, and I still hadn't been terribly interested because part of the problem was I wasn't seeing any characters from anything I was familiar with anymore. It was all very very new. If you stop watching for 6 years in the middle and like Code Geass comes out in the interim and a bunch of other things, then it's like, oh, hey. They would, of course, start making all of the new good figures, knowing the new good method were of new series. They didn't really backpedal much, but I found one that was Noriko from Gunbuster. I was like, oh, hey, about as classic a character as you can get. And it was cute, so I picked that up. And then that wedged something else open. That's like, oh man, this is a goddamn this this is a pit this is a deep, deep pit. Uh, Later, I would pull other things, and I'd just seek out things that were interesting, and sometimes that introduced me to a series, many of which didn't stick. Like there, damn it, I can't remember the one. What's her name in the Seven Companions? It was a good figure, but I don't remember the series. But then there was a really interesting one with a girl with a wearing a jacket and a hat and walking amongst what looked like phone poles that had knives on it, and there's an extra pair of legs so that she could be wading in water rather than standing, and all of the stuff was removable. It was really neat. I'm like, hey, that's great. I'm just gonna get this. And then at some point later, I'm like, what's this from? Bakemonogatari, huh? I'll have to check that out. And so I had more feedback loops for yet more stuff. But it meant that my reentry was multifold for a bit. It was a lot easier to get anime, and Ray would toss a bunch at me. At that point, we didn't necessarily do too much on the forum, but he would pass stuff my way. I could seek out torrents pretty easily. I was going to cons a lot, and doing yet more things. Uh, I was collecting a bit more, watching more, and so that was how I got back in, which included a lot of conning, which eventually did wear out. Amusingly, the timing of it wore out a whole lot with the fact that I couldn't conveniently go with my friends anymore. In that
Hmm.
they would fill their car, so there was no room for me to even squeeze in as a passenger. So everything became with me having to drive, and as work requirements leaned in more and more, uh, and other stuff, I'm like, okay, I went to fewer and fewer. And the only one that I kept going to since then has been Otaku still, which I went to last year and I'm going to this year. But to wrap that back around, when you were talking about paneling, that's what con going has become for me at this point. There's a period of time in which I would go to industry panels, but I learned pretty quickly that other than discotheques, they're all boring and no different from me reading your article telling me what licenses they put there, because no one knew how to put on an industry panel that was at all interesting. So there's like a year in which I tried there, but then I just started going to other people's panels and looking for stuff. So the first thing that I do when I can is I bring up guidebook and I start seeking stuff out. Uh, like going to the panels for the Anime World Order folks because they'll have a bunch of them, and half the time I'll get to them incidentally because they will just be doing stuff. They're of exactly the right kind of age bracket and the interest bracket for a lot of things. That means that when I see something that's interesting and I go to it, I'm like, oh, Gerald's running it, which is kind of funny. And then I'll go to the next one and then I'll see them like the row over from me because they found that panel interesting, even though it was run by someone else. And I'm like, oh, it's an Evan Minto panel. So that's where other than hanging out on Discord or chatting with people on Twitter, uh, there's a weird little community of it's like a mental community for me of when I go to panels at certain cons, I end up seeing the same people just because of the topics without realizing it. I'm not chatting with them
Hmm.
at it. I'll ask them ridiculous questions once in a while. but but it's the last holding con community for me, not anime art auction purchasers, not anime music video sorts, not anything else, but panel goers who happen to attend the same ones. Uh, and for me, a lot of times that means making sure to hit the Japanese guest ones that I really want to. If Mariyama or other folks are back at Otakon again, I'll make sure to hit their panels. So that's literally what I do. I started going to like my first concert, my first attended live concert. I don't count things that that you did during high school for band competitions or stuff like that. To see someone at concert was Naomi Tamura, who I think was Otakon 2008, either 2008 or 2009. And after that, I started going to all of the concerts there as well, because that was another interesting thing. I'm like, oh, hey, that's cool. They get musical artists here, and they're good. So, uh, Radio was at a recent one, and that was some good shit. So that's what cons are to me now. Panels and concerts, and still helping my friends occasionally at their booth, but there's usually not a whole lot for me to do other than bring food and keep them hydrated.
So I have just one more question for you. If you have more for me, that's totally cool, but I just have one more for you.
Yeah.
Over the years, since you first started with VHS tapes, how large is your collection now?
Oh, good lord. Very, very. I mean, the VHS tapes technically haven't gone anywhere, but I almost don't consider them part of the collection just because I'm not even sure I can play them anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
However, they still exist, and so do my laser discs. So yes, I have a laser. In fact, I bought laser disc collections at the last Otakon. Another one of those things like collecting cells. There's a part of me that still wishes Laserdisc was the medium of choice, just because I want the art. But so those are more for just amusing collector's value, though. But obviously, when things started hitting DVD, I picked up quite a lot. Not a huge amount though, because they still were, constrained to 4 episodes on each, and so to collect a set, you would usually be getting this thick wad of DVDs, which was a little physically imposing for it, which is odd to say since I just said that I want Laserdisc still, but they're very thin. So there's a period of time in which you started being able to get sets, or at least big wads of anime, for a lot more reasonably priced. When Amazon's third-party market came there, I was looking and was like, oh, I can get all of Razafon for a reasonable price. I can get all of Captain Tyler for a reasonable price. I would later learn, of course, that those were bootlegs, but they worked, but I didn't really pursue them more. But at a certain point, anything in DVD, and especially anything after Blu-ray, was like, you could buy this one thing which has everything in it, and it's basically one thin pack, something smaller than half the size of a VHS, and smaller than it ever was, and it's HD quality, and it's the entire goddamn series, and it cost you somewhere between $20 and $40, whereas before that was 2 episodes of Evangelion. And I'm like, okay, so I would still do that. And at certain points, you'd have huge sales and everything else, and I would just pick up stuff willy nilly. I have piles of Blu-rays that are kind of unsorted, so that's my pile of shame is a literal pile of shame. I do need to reorganize shelves, but if you're talking about just DVDs alone, certainly hundreds. I'd guess it would come. It'd be over 500 in some fashion, and by that I just mean different physical discs. I don't I don't think I get close to 1,000 in there, but I have a lot of other janky stuff as well, collector's editions and other things. And that's just anime. My manga is larger. And if you want to, I guess that becomes part of it, and that was something that I know I wanted to, back when we were doing our Orange Road assassination classroom cast. I wanted to use it as a lens into the fandom, so we're talking about literal fandom here. uh so as far as your anime collection goes, where how large is that? But more, I think more interestingly would be, what else have you delved into? What do you think might be the most interesting thing that you've been collecting, that represents perhaps a more unique part of your fandom, and your personal interest?
In terms of my collection is actually not as large as I would like it to be. I grew up very poor. I did not have a lot of money in my early days, so a lot of anime that have collected over the years were later on when I was able to get more money and was able to, spend it a little more freely.
Right.
So my collection is not as large as I would like it to be. I still um go out of my way a once or twice a year whenever there's a good sale on. I will go back and I will stock my shelves with even more anime.
Grab
Um
take
because there
advantage
can
of Right Stuff or a Sentai
Yeah,
Filmworks
exactly.
sale. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I enjoy expanding my anime collection. I do collect other little things. I have a few figures, little trinkets like that. But the bulk of my collection has always been like DVDs and Blu-rays. That's been what I've wanted to collect the
Right.
most of. So like I said, I it's not as large as I would like it to be. There's still a lot of gaps in my collection that I would love to fill in. Um, so
I like how leading
there's
that phrase is, of course, as I would like it to be, includes I own a mansion and it's filled top to bottom with weeb shit. I'd like it to be that, but maybe that's unrealistic. After you're discovered, and become an idol in Japan, maybe that
yeah, yeah. My man cave is gonna be my weeb cave.
can. Sure.
But in terms of like the prized possession in my collection, I this is kind of my weird nerd flex where whenever I'm talking about my collection and I want to brag a little bit, this is what I pull out. Is I have the original DVD singles and art box for the first season of When They Cry. And the art box is autographed by Ryukushi07.
Nice. I do
And
like.
that is my nerd flex that if I'm ever feeling like bragging to someone, that's what I pull out. It's like, oh yes, I happen to have the original creator's autograph on the original art box that was released back in 2006 or whenever Geneon decided to take their ball and go home.
Geneon. Oh man. Dude.
Hmm.
That's one of those things that sticks with me. It's all of those old, publishers, distribution methods, the logos and the sound effects that would accompany them for emotion, stuff like that. Things you don't get a whole lot of in the modern era, where it was all like a Funimation or a Crunchyroll
Yeah,
splash
yeah.
screen. but including in front of movies in the theaters, which is interesting. I think one of the more personal parts of my collection started, interestingly enough, in two places. The first of them was a really peculiar thing that I would do when going into Chinatown. I mentioned before that that became the way that we would support our addiction. It was the only affordable way for a bunch of my friends were all high schoolers still at that point because I got to know a bunch of people who were much more in your age bracket, uh, whereas I was many years out of high school at that point. But beggars can't be choosers.
To be fair, you and I are not that far apart
No, we're
in
not
age.
that far apart, but what I mean is people who are 5 years younger than me, stuff like that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
uh, which meant a whole lot more back when they were still in high school and I was not,
yeah, yeah,
than it means
yeah,
now,
yeah,
where it means literally nothing at all.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but where was I going with that? The oh right, because we would be doing the Chinatown trips, and they would have as much money as they could have gotten, saved up from allowances or gotten out of their parents. I would have whatever I tended to have more available because I was just working a job, even though it was, data entry. At the very least, it was still something that had an actual salary attached.
Mm-hmm.
When we'd go in, Chinatown had a bunch of stuff. It was the anime tapes, but there were a bunch of stores which had, all kinds of bootleg junk posters. One of my friends picked up a ton of posters. I picked up some. I liked interesting wall hangings more. Of those cloth hangings. I got really into music CDs. My first ones were actually purchased at Anime East 95. I picked up some t shirts for someone's room, which was filled with bootleg stuff. I got a few Orange Road t shirts because the only ones on the floor were some really horrible looking licensed Bubblegum Crisis ones. They were very
Yeah,
pathetic.
yeah,
And even if the bootleg ones were iron on stuff, at the very least, they had great designs and large sizes and interesting colors. But more than that, that's where I picked up my first OSTs. So collecting CDs became a big part of the Chinatown trip for me. I'd usually come home with 8 or so new CDs to add to my collection. But one of the other things that I always looked for were decks of cards.
mm.
Do you know why I would look for decks of cards?
I couldn't tell you.
Because while the back of it might have a nice design, but if they were done right, I would look at it, it could be up to 50 to 54 unique pieces of art from the series that they pulled out to put into the design to print up the cards from. So it was my way to get a bunch of art from the show or even from the manga series at that point. Uh and be able to I didn't play games with them. I collected them for the ability to flip through them and enjoy the art.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we were still, deep into Magic the Gathering at that point, so anything card related was still kind of a literal high for us. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Was
and
this back before you had like scanners and?
I had a scanner at home, but it was not something that could take any good thing. It would have been, like a 300 DPI scanner or
Got it.
maybe a 1200 one later. uh, I could go, onto websites still and print stuff, but again, I didn't have a good printer. I didn't have anything that was satisfying. So this was an art pursuit for me, and at I think it was a Dreamation, which is a gaming convention. So the same group, we were still much more heavily into Magic the Gathering and role playing games, and going to attending gaming conventions because they had a lot of events and just interesting stuff. And it was fun to hang out and get a hotel room and fit it with anywhere between 8 and 14 people, and sleep for 3 hours and then go compete in card game tournaments, all of that kind of stuff. It was a ridiculous time. uh, but at one of the dealers down there, you'd have a, like any weird gaming convention, you'd have a weird crossover of people there. Obviously a lot of stuff, so you could buy a bunch of dice, you could buy a bunch of games. You could witness the end of West End Games, which had they did the Star Wars RPG was what they were best known for,
Mhm.
but they had a bunch of other stuff, and that effectively they still had a table at a convention, even though I think they'd gone into Chapter 11 or whatever. They were bankrupt, but they were still at a con, and at the end of the con, they just kind of left all of their stuff at the table, or they were handing it out. So we picked up boxes of Star Wars manuals. We had 3 boxes of the Species RPG, which was hilarious. We'd never seen it before. It was like their latest thing. I'm almost sure that that was like the last thing that they put together and hoped would sell well to bring them
Mhm.
solvency, and it just failed. And so we drove to a nearby. We left a bunch of them on cars in the parking lot of the gaming convention, which entertained us. Because if you have literally 60 to 80 of these things, what are you gonna do with them? We didn't
Yeah.
need this many. Then we got a better idea, and before we were going home, we drove to a near, a near because it was Sunday on which we were leaving. We drove to a nearby church, which had people in car, and we left copies of the Species RPG on the windshields of a bunch of people at church. We did not stick around to record the expressions on anyone's faces, but I do. I I do like imagining what that might have been about at some point. But anyway, at one of these cons, at the same table in which I picked up a bunch of little keychains with a skull on them, which I didn't actually want as keychains. I just wanted the little rubbery skulls because they look cool to use as counters for Vampire: The Eternal Struggle. Because that was good. Use actual little skulls for them, or to use as tokens for skeletons playing Legend of the Five Rings or something like that. I haven't seen them in a while. I should find out what happened to them. At any rate, the guy also had on the backboard a bunch of art books. Uh, and that's one of those things that I started investing in as well, because I just wanted, creator art, promotional art. It's a reason that I still prize things like my Viz single issues of Ranma and Maisen Koku from back in the day, because it's large form, full color art, and you'd only get 1 or 2 things that were related in Japanese tankobon. And even if you had chapter cover art, it wasn't really done as a full thing, and it was all black and white. So what you ended up getting is everything that was ever available for the series could end its way on the cover. And same thing with the art book, as I wanted art from the creators. And a lot of these are just like screenshots of the anime, which is not what I wanted, and interviews, which I would have loved if I could read them, but since they're in Japanese, that wasn't a thing. Uh, So what I picked up from there was one or both of the Devil Hunter Yoko art books at the time, which had my qualification was at least half of it basically had to be full page, full art, and if the rest of
Mm-hmm.
it was other stuff that I couldn't read or interact with, well, that was the price of entry for me. So
Yeah,
as
yeah.
part of it's not really a prized part of my collection in that I prize it most, but I have a bunch of art books, and it's one of those things that I still like picking up and still like going through. I'll pick up interesting things here and there, like there's a perfect blue complete storyboard of the movie, which is crazy, and I enjoy that. Excuse me, I enjoy that kind of stuff. If you were to ask me what my most prized possession of is, one of them is sadly something that I haven't been able to find. And I think it might be because one of my old friends just kept it at some point. Figured that maybe, I don't know if they absconded with it or I showed it to them and they just didn't think about it and wandered off with it. I haven't been able to find it though, but that was when I mentioned the artist that I would get involved with, and he gave me a sketchbook, which I would get a whole bunch of sketches from people with. So that represents a bunch of years of me going to cons and getting a bunch of people to I mean, it was really just for signatures, but most of the
Mm-hmm.
time, because I already had people who were doing sketches as part of their autograph sessions, even if that wasn't a part of it, when they would flip through and see that, like, there was a Mikimoto sketch of Minmay in it, they would feel compelled to compete with the fact that there's a Mikimoto sketch of Minmay in it and do their own. So it had any number of people. Adam Warren was in it, drawing Yuri, stuff like that. So that would be my most prized one if I could find it, because it has the most personal connection to me and the creative talent for the industry. Uh, Instead, though, I have a cell from episode 5 of Orange Road. The very end, there's a scene with Ayukawa and Kyosuke on a bench, and a drunken confession, which amusingly I wouldn't know exactly what it said for years. Because that was Orange Road. I had episodes 5 through 8 on a tape, and I watched them over and over, and I had
Mm-hmm.
that raw for forever. Then my rental shop had the like the OVAs with subtitles in them, so I watched those because those came out separately from the show, which I don't think the guy ever got the actual. He didn't get the actual show; he just got the OVAs and the movie, which was kind of hilarious. But so I have a cell of the two of them on that bench with the background art and everything. And if you were to talk about one single thing, that's, you know, like the of the classic era, that's a frame from the one of the instances that drives the most doki doki within my cold dead heart. And it's really good shot, and frankly, it's probably worth a whole lot more. I spent a lot at the time, but cells have gotten ridiculously expensive these days, so I've
Yeah.
gotten out of that habit. I can't afford that crap. Uh, so that would probably be my. If you're going to have one single prized possession, I think it would be that. But I think the single most amusing possession I have are, I collected decks of cards until I got to 52 of them so that I could say I had a deck of cards per card. And then I picked up 2 more so I could cover the Jokers. And then I've collected more over the years anyway. So I don't know how many I have right now, but it's many.
Yeah.
And I don't do anything with them. but I enjoy having 70 decks of cards of anime. So it's funny.
Did you have any other questions that you wanted to fire off for us, or are we
I don't
done?
I don't think I had any for you. Now I know that we sent up a flare uh on the in Discord and on Twitter, but I don't think I saw anyone who had questions that they wanted to ask of both of us. I did. Did you get anything from the
No, I
outside world?
didn't. Nope, I did not.
I did get some from a source, but a lot of them aren't really. Some of them feel like they could be subjects for a countdown episode,
Uh
but
huh.
rather than being asked about us and our otakudom, so I'll just breeze through a few, and if any of them are interesting, we can decide whether we want to sink it in. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Do you think there's some anime essential viewing for anyone who's serious about the genre? Never mind what their favorites are. What you assign for a course in Anime 101. So yeah, again, that feels like countdown content.
Yeah, yeah.
What should be consigned to oblivion or should never have existed ever? Again, I think we've done something close
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, let's see. Your house is on fire. You have time only to rescue one set. You have time only to rescue like stuff you can carry out with your hands.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, what would you be carrying out with you? And I suppose we covered that by way of talking about prized possessions.
Yeah, yeah.
This isn't about us. What country do you think will dominate anime 5 years from now? I'm I'm gonna go with Japan.
Yeah, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Japan is probably going to keep their stranglehold for a little bit longer.
Is there an anime series you enjoy but wouldn't be able to watch if the music was poor?
That's an interesting question.
That's interesting. What about if the art and music were excellent, but the story was no better than C minus? Great story and music, but feeble artwork. That sounds like an interesting one to turn into a countdown. Would be something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. What are these series where one aspect tanks it for you? Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If only one example of anime survives on a devastated Earth, which one would you want future archaeologists to discover in its remains? Does does that just go to your favorite series, or do you?
Uh if we're talking like the prime example of the best that anime can be, I would have to go with either my favorite, which is Assassination Classroom, or if I wanted to point out series that are just difficult to argue as anything less than masterpieces. That's what I think is what the question is getting at. In that case, I would go with either Violet Evergarden or Madoka Magica.
There you go.
Yeah, if we're talking series that it's hard to argue them being anything less than a masterpiece, those would be the ones that I would go
Now,
with.
would Rebellion
If I
make it, or
would what?
would Rebellion make it, or just the
Just a
series?
TV
Okay.
series. Just a TV
Sorry,
series.
Rebellion. Sorry. the I was wondering if if you're thinking about it that way, would you throw something like Bebop up there because it's got a couple core, but it's also representing something that's central to it, or again like Evangelion because it's specifically there. I think this that question though fits me well because while I don't believe Space Brothers does like is an exemplar of anime, I feel like it's a better exemplar of certain things of anime, and then just aspirational things about humankind that I would
Hmm.
like aliens to know about us. So I feel comfortable in giving that slot to Space Brothers, and it happens to be my favorite thing. So I don't know.
Hey, that works.
Are there anime you loved when you were younger but wouldn't like it if you came to them now that you're older?
Oh God, yes.
No, I know, right. Exactly. So
Yeah, there
we
there are
we covered
many.
something simpler, similar to it, and we tend to talk about it in conjunction with other discussions when we're doing it in countdown. But I guess central to it is, have your tastes changed significantly over the years,
Yes. Um.
and in what ways then? So
Yeah, I was about to get to that.
yeah.
uh, what ways have my taste changed since I was younger? The most obvious one is that I'm not anti pervy anime. I have no problems with pervy anime as long as it's done well. If it's done well, then pervy anime can be fun. Um, However, back in the day, I was taking in a lot of trash anime and giving it higher scores than I probably should have. Um,
You were actually rating them at the time too.
oh yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean things like Sakura Diaries was the first like kind of pervy anime that I watched, and I was giving that high scores. Kiss Sis for a long
Mhm.
time. I was hardcore into that and loved every bit of it.
And
So
now when you
things.
recognize the OP in Anime Music Quiz, you apologize for knowing it.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. So yeah, so I mean, back in the day, I was much more forgiving of pervy and harem anime in general. Um, these days, like I said, I'm not against it, and if you enjoy it, more power to you. But I tend to be a lot more picky about which ones from that genre I pick up and stick with for an entire season.
Were there any other major genres that you could think of? Certain action, combat, or sports, or other stuff? Was there a period of time? I know there's a general tendency when you're younger to just not care about the things that aren't terribly mature in general, which can include a lot of fisticuff hack and slash edge lord stuff.
Uh huh.
But what was there a time in which you were really into certain things back then, that you would not be now, or that when you've revisited you've had to cringe at your past self and would not
Like I
pursue the
said,
genre?
um, it's mostly things like harem anime from back in the 90s and 2000s that I like I said, was a lot more forgiving of back in the day. Love Hina is an example.
Mhm.
Girls Bravo is an example. To Love Ru to an extent was is an example. So it's mostly the romantic harem series
Gotcha.
that back in the day I loved them, loved them, loved them, and then eventually I just kind of moved on and don't pay as much attention to them these days.
Yeah, so right, in that case it becomes, is there genre? Uh, I don't think. I mean, I would watch stuff like Love Hina back in the day, but since that was, what was that, 2001?
Something like that.
So that was me watching with my friends, and we were laughing along with it, but we were largely considering it a lark at the time
Uh huh.
anyway. So we did. I feel like I feel like it's a little weird, but I don't know if my tastes have changed much since I was 15. And I'm sure I watched more. I think some of this comes down to certain timing, uh, and certain circumstance. So the timing wise, in the beginning, anime. I watched almost no TV series. There wasn't a whole lot of TV series. That was the age of OVAs and movies. It was the age of a crap ton of sci-fi. So it's not like I'm like, I wouldn't watch anything sci-fi. Screw that. Uh, I mean, we keep pursuing it. It didn't attract me specifically, but I mean, I'll watch your Vivies quite readily, and 86s and other stuff. I feel like possibly my most cringy thing was actually enjoying Gundam Wing back in the day. Maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
uh but that's where one of the things, because that's where anime stopped being an a lone hobby for me. Gundam Wing, Flame of Recca, Kenshin. So the time in which I watched the most shonen battle-y stuff would have been during this era. Gundam Wing came in as well. Anything that was huge in the basically the mid to late 90s was what we were feeding off of. But we fed off a whole lot of everything, and none of them were particularly into your Dragon Balls. Even going back to and picking up. So, and that was not something that I had really pursued. I watched Fist of the North Star, but I didn't pursue anything further there. I had fun with some of the edgy stuff like Ninja Scroll, of course, but I did not get into it. There was a certain level of what I considered, otaku meatheads back in the day that made a number of those things unappealing to me anyway.
Uh huh.
And I'm like, you guys don't know what Naosuke is, but you can't stop talking about Fist of the North Star and how Goku can kick everyone's butt. Uh, so that really didn't stick. A lot of comedies and stuff I would get into, but I'd still always enjoy something more like your Captain Tyler or your Excel Saga, and not as much harem rom com stuff. I'd enjoy some rom com things generally, but I never rated them terribly highly. I was really into certain key shojo titles back at the time, and I don't mean Sailor Moon. I mean things like They Were 11. Uh, coming across something like Rose of Versailles early on. I have a feeling that if I was introduced to Chihaya Furu like back in the day, it still would have immediately appealed to me and been one of my favorite
Hmm.
things ever. It's really weird to say, but I don't think my tastes have changed much. I've gotten a little bit looser in the other way, not where I'm embarrassed about certain things that I enjoyed that I no longer feel like I should, but that I've started to enjoy other things that I normally wouldn't by being able to successfully turn brain off and enjoy pointless thing like Food Wars. But I don't know. It's weird. I feel like I need to run off the whole session here, but I don't feel like I'm running across anything that makes me terribly embarrassed to have really enjoyed it, either genre wise or work wise at the time. and I
Uh-huh.
don't feel like there's anything now that would really not have appealed to me back then. So I don't know. I guess I am an unchanging, pointless square. That's all I got. So if you too,
Did you
dear listener, want to hear about my shit taste, continue subscribe.
did you have any other questions on your list or anything else to ask?
I don't think so. I usually like to springboard off other stuff, but unless there's any aspect of your otaku-ness that you didn't introduce or feel like you wanted to bring up before the end, I think we got it covered.
All right, let's go ahead. Let's wrap things up then. Thank you again for joining me for another fun discussion. It's been a blast doing 50 podcasts with you, and here's to 50 more.
Same, same. Well, let's try to get our ability to do them more in gear. Slap myself around. But
And thank you to all of you for listening to us talk for the last 50 episodes. Again, we can't do this without listeners. So, we appreciate every single one of you who listen and occasionally submit a comment. And yeah, we hope that you will stick around and continue to listen to our podcasts. And until then, or until our next episode, that is, have a great night, everybody.
good night, everybody.